Good morning. Today I will briefly discuss a short history of Asian architecture. Just enough that, just in case you find yourself in the presence of a historical Asian monument, at least you would be able to tell what kind of architectural style it embodies. Maaring masabi mo kung ano yung architecture style niya base sa kung ano yung mga nag-influence sa kanya tulad ng religion or culture, as well as yung iba't ibang architectural elements na makikita mo sa kanya. The first documented Asian architectural style is the Chinese architecture, and it dates as far back as 16th century BC. It had a lot of influence to its neighboring countries, neighboring East Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc. One such great example of this architecture is the Imperial Palace or the Forbidden City. Maraming katangiang taglay ang Chinese architecture, pero ang mga babanggitin ko ay yung mga importanteng details lang. Kapag alam mo, masasabi mo kagad kung itong istrukturang ba ito ay Chinese architecture o hindi, base pa lang sa itsura niya. Structures are mainly made out of wood. Intricate structural framework, especially that of the roof, e.g. the series of posts and lintels and the dogongs. And its roof is made of ceramic with its corners upturned and pointing outwards. No? Also, the roofs can be double eaves, hip, gable, or hip and gable. Chinese architecture also partakes in landscape garden architecture. Chinese architecture also groups its structures systematically, and there's a prominent adherence to the feng shui orientation. So sequentially, we also have the Indian temple architecture, which is documented in the first millennium BC. So it is a stone temple architecture that relies heavily on stone masonry. It can be classified into two types. First is the Nagara style, which makes use of the curved spires, and we also have the Dravidian style, which makes use of the tiered form. One such prominent example of this is the Kandariya Mahadeva, although it is built far later on. It is finished in the year 1030. The Kandariya Mahadeva is an example of Nagara style temple, and the Nagara style temple makes use of the following architectural features. We have the Shikara, which is the massive vertical element or the curved spire. Next, we have the Amalaka. Ito yung form that resembles a lotus bud. It sits atop every spire, every curved spire or the Shikara. Next, we have the Mandapa, the pillared halls that can be open or closed depending on the presence of walls. The plans of Indian temple architecture are typically rectilinear with curved spires. We also have Islamic architecture with its own sets of architectural features. Islamic architecture dates as far back as the 7th century, which makes it the third in my list. It encompasses both secular and religious style of architecture. The earliest architectural marvel of Islamic architecture is the Dome of the Rock, which is as early as Islamic architecture itself. Its construction started in 688 and was finished on 692, the year 692, still within the 7th century. It consolidated some of the characteristics of Islamic architecture, although does not best exemplify it. The following are the architectural elements that Islamic architecture conceptualized. You might find that a certain Islamic monument display minarets. These are the towers where the call to prayer is sung. Next is the domes. So these are the almost spherical forms that sits atop every mosque. A mosque really is the church equivalent of Islam. Muqarnas, a three-dimensional ornamentation. It resembles stalactites and it's placed on vaults. It is used to ornament vaults. Islamic architecture also makes use of pointed arches, especially horseshoe arches or the keyhole arches. There is also multifoil arches and calligraphy and geometric patterns. Calligraphy of Islamic cultures have transcended from its purpose as a written language and gained artistic and decorative value. This is due to its main use in the Quran. It can be found written in some surfaces of Islamic cultures. Moreover, the Taj Mahal of India made use of more elements compared to the Dome of the Rock. However, it is built very later on, starting from 1632, ending its construction in 1653. Next is the Indonesian architecture. It contains architectural influences from Hindu and Buddhism. This can be attributed to the country's geographic circumstances. Despite being heavily influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism in their architecture, there actually remains an architectural identity that is mainly influenced by their culture and folklore. This architectural style is called the Batak architecture. Batak architecture alludes to certain symbolisms, folk tales, and other aspects of cultural traditions. Batak architecture is residential in nature. The typical Batak house is raised on stilts. A series of wooden posts support the superstructure, and wooden beams are laterally fixed to the posts to further reinforce the structure. The typical Batak house has walls that extend outwards and upwards that are wooden and non-structural. It also has roof frames that are mainly made out of wood and bamboo. The roof makes use of tension to hold its component parts together, and this tension is evident in its outward gables and curved ridge. It is also thatched, so that pointy gable does not only have an artistic value but rather a structural value that helps the structure, the roof, stay in place. The first Batak architecture was documented in around 20th century, but it could have very well existed earlier than 20th century. So that concludes the brief discussion of the Asian historical architecture. I hope you learned something. I hope that the next time you find yourself in the presence of an Asian historical monument, you would be able to identify what kind of architectural style it embodies. And that concludes it. So thank you for listening and see you next time.